Welcome again to GPS, God's Prophetic Surprises. We are here working through Revelation chapter 12, and I have with me my colleagues, that including Michael Kelly, who is pastor of the Mount Rubidoux Seventh-day Adventist Church, Philip Milosavljevic, who is one of the pastors at the Loma Linda University Church, and Shifra Fepuleai. I think I got that right. She is one of the pastors at the Campus Hill Church in Loma Linda, California. I'm Jon Paulien, and I'm a professor of religion at Loma Linda University, and delighted to be together with you today. And I have a little bit of a special, because last week I spent in Hawaii with my grandchildren. And we were in quarantine, you know, the COVID-19 stuff, so we couldn't leave the house. But what we could do is do a painting together with my 4.5-year-old granddaughter on the view from the front of the house. And here you have it. There it is. There's the mountains there are pretty impressive on the southeast coast of Oahu. Wow. And that house is pretty lame, I think. But it's what you do when you don't know much about watercolors. And my 4.5-year-old taught me, and we worked together on that, and that was a lot of fun. I've also been talking with Philip about the fact that the university church has been opening up, and I think has had a few adventures in that process. You want to share with that for
a year or two? Have. So our young adult ministry just opened 3 weeks ago, and we've been doing it nicely, and people are really excited to gather together again. There's been hope in their eyes, excitement about the future to come. I think one thing that I just had to make a decision about is I can't allow this pandemic to allow us to lose the gospel mission. You know, just because churches are closed technically doesn't mean that mission stops, and it doesn't mean that the church stops to exist. And so at some point after we've been doing online worship for 3 or 4 months, I felt as though, in accordance with the state laws that we have here and our conference policies, that we would open up on Friday evenings for our young adult ministry, and that's been so wonderful. And then the other thing that our church has been part of is a ministry called Fusion. I'm going to show you a t-shirt right here. 909 is the area code of San Bernardino, and they've been going out 7 days a week, over 100 meals to the homeless every single day. They've been going out almost now 180 days in a row. And this ministry is now just starting to kind of form in different places. So they have it in Phoenix. They're just launching another one in Sacramento. The Philippines just opened up as another opportunity for this kind of homeless outreach and the way it's done. And it's really been proven to be so beautiful, because the team that goes out every day, they decided we're not just going to give out food, we're going to try and build relationships intentionally with people. And so it's about the relationships that they build. It isn't just handing them the food that makes it meaningful. It's, I know your name, I know your family, I know where you live, and I'm willing to sit here with you and talk about things that are just basic to life. It doesn't mean just they're preaching at them, but then they do give them an opportunity. Hey, is there anything we could pray for you for? And then even, would you be interested in Bible studies? And so about a dozen people have already been baptized through this homeless outreach program, going to the men's shelters, under the overpass. We go to various parks. I'm just grateful to be on the outskirts of this and watching it. It birthed out of our young adult pastor's vision, who was previously here, and then it just blew up into this, now an organization of its own. And so it's been really beautiful to see that happening in the midst of COVID, providing meaningful ministry.
And the wristbands?
Oh, and how we do ministry on the Friday evening gatherings, we have everyone wearing masks, obviously, but then they also do wristbands to indicate how close you want to get to people. So we have red, yellow, and green. Red indicating, I'm just glad to be here. Please, don't get too close to me. I won't get too close to you. Shifra, she's like, yep, that would be me. Yeah. And then yellow is, I'm okay with having a conversation with you. And then green is, high fives, side hugs, okay, you know, let's be friends and stay connected. So we kind of have that as people have their own preference. It provides a little bit of sense of everyone observing one another and taking cues from that, as opposed to kind of having that awkward, like, can I give you a hug? Can I give you a fist? Like, what's our relationship here? And so that's been really helpful to do ministry in that way.
I'm stealing that idea.
Go ahead, Michael.
No, I'm stealing that idea. I love it.
Yeah, I just thought I wanted to share it because it's very good. I identify as a yellow myself, I think, probably.
Yeah.
But,
I was
get the elbows out. You
get the elbows with that, yeah. One of our young adult elders who's a nurse came up with that idea.
That's a fantastic idea. Well, we need to get into the book of Revelation, and because as we go through these things with great ideas and creativity, etc., we always want to keep an eye to the Word of God. And perhaps no book is more relevant today than Revelation. So, Michael, if you're ready, give us verses 13 through 16 of Revelation 12.
Yes, so here's what the Word of God says from the New American Standard Version of the Bible. And when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. Both the two wings of the great eagle were given to the woman, so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. And the serpent poured water out like a river out of his mouth after the woman, so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river which the dragon poured out of his mouth.
All right, thank you. There's something I'm noticing in this text, and that is it starts out with a dragon, and then it moves to a serpent in verse 14, and then in verse 15, it's still a serpent, and then in verse 16, it's a dragon. What do you make of this?
I think of the fact that there's a shift in focus and intention maybe when it becomes the serpent, because I think of a serpent being one who slithers on the ground and is kind of left to being maybe amongst people, but the dragon can seem very imposing and at a distance and ominous. It's just kind of my first observation as I think about that.
Nice word, ominous. Really good. You've got the gold, man. Ominous and wristbands. Mm-hmm. I have a basic question. In the Greek, are the words different? Serpent and dragon?
Yes. Dragon would be drakon, and the serpent is opsis. So not even close in terms of pronunciation or spelling. Okay. In fact, I'm not sure they have a single letter in common. So that is not the connection. So the author is bouncing back and forth for some kind of purpose. I like Philip's idea that perhaps it's a different mode of attack. Any other ideas?
I guess when I think of a serpent, referring back to, the Garden of Eden, a dragon doesn't come in the Garden of Eden, but it's a serpent that's very deceptive, with words. And I think, even tying into Philip, but this dragon seems to have more of an overt opposing power. Like, you don't have to guess. I'm a dragon. I'm right here. A serpent, slithery, in between, more deceptive as opposed to powerful. So maybe the serpent, deceptive with words, dragon, more imposing with power.
I like that. You notice in both 14 and 15, well, 15 for sure. In 14, it says the face of the serpent, but in 15, it's the mouth of the serpent. And when you have a serpent connected with a mouth, that definitely runs you back, Michael, to Genesis 3, where the serpent there was not using intimidation or force, but was attempting to be persuasive, to deceive Eve. I think all of this goes back to verse 9. And the author must have had this in mind in making this shift, because otherwise it wouldn't make a lot of sense. But in verse 9, he says, the great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. So I think the serpent and the dragon are two different ways of describing Satan, the adversary, the dark side of the great conflict.
I find it interesting that in kind of modern day culture, I remember listening to a debate a pastor named Mark Driscoll had on actually public television with a famed atheist, and the atheist was arguing against even the existence of a devil, and how most in society, you know, if they're leaning towards a very critical way of viewing spirituality, I mean, they don't even think that the devil even exists, let alone that he would have different ways of working, whether it be a serpent or a dragon. People don't even think about how Satan is influencing potentially their personal lives along with events in history and culture.
And my question for that would be the cultural generational question, like, and so what, right? Like, what would that do, like, to our lived experience? If there is no Satan, no serpent, no dragon, no devil in reality, what does that mean to my reality? Does that change the gospel message to my reality?
Well, if you leave the Bible aside and you look at reality, and you say, what does reality tell me about God? It would certainly tell you that God exists, I think. If you're familiar at all with the anthropic principle, scientists have discovered some 15 to 20 ways in which the entire universe seems to be constructed for the sake of this earth and the human race. That sounds so counterintuitive. It doesn't make any sense. When you read a book by Stephen Hawking, who's the Einstein of the 21st century, and he lays out all of those things, it's kind of like, whoa, you know, the most logical conclusion is that, first of all, this earth was designed for a purpose. And second of all, it was designed. There is an intelligence behind the universe as we know it. Second thing you can know from the universe is that God must be very powerful, overwhelming in size. The problem is you leave the Bible aside, and is God good or is God bad? Or a mixture of the two? It is with the concept of Satan that we come into the possibility of thinking that the universe was designed totally good and has been malformed, if you wish, by the free will of a creature who is in opposition to God. I don't know of any other explanation for suffering and evil that comes even close to that biblical concept. So to encourage people, I mean, Revelation 12, this is where it all comes together. You have, on the one side, the principle of force and untruth, shall we say, force and deception to persuade people. And on the other side, the principle of truth and gentle persuasion. So you have two fundamental principles, and you go further back. The one principle is self-centeredness. I want to do what's in it for me. I remember the kids' cartoon, Charlotte's Web. There was the mouse who was always saying, "What's in it for me? Me," you know, and that articulates the idea. It's all about me. And if everybody is all about me, it's a very, very ugly world, as we've seen in recent and distant events. On the other side is the principle of other-centeredness, which leads to freedom, gentleness, truth, telling the truth, etc. See, Revelation portrays two giant principles at war and at work in every setting. And I think, I don't know how you address these things successfully without that. Michael?
Yeah, I've always looked, when we look at Revelation, particularly 12, is we see that I think the entire book is this battle for our worship. I think Christ is saying, hey, I would love for you guys to, connect and worship with me. But then you've got this dragon who says, well, no, connect and worship with me. And God's way of wooing us there is through that self-sacrificial love to get the worship. And the enemy's way, which we know the dragon is a serpent, is I'll either trick you or I'll force you. But both of them are after our attention and our focus. One just uses love, as you said, to draw us in, and the other says, I will either force you, hurt you, so you want to do it, or I'll trick you into thinking I am that other-centered person, so that you can connect with me. He wants, the dragon is after us in our worship and our attention.
I wonder how, in essence, kind of to build up what Mike you're saying, this notion of the devil coming after us. Here in verse 15, it says that the serpent cast water out of his mouth towards the woman. Professor, I would love to know kind of what exactly does that mean, Satan coming after us with water? What is that indicative of?
That was my favorite part of the passage.
So what do you think?
No other reason than intrigue.
So that you have it coming out of the mouth of the serpent. So if you go back to the Garden of Eden, water coming out of the mouth of the serpent would represent what?
The words.
Words.
The lies.
Of some sort. But these are words that have destructive power. That's where the flooding comes in. And I think I've mentioned earlier that serpents, rivers and serpents are seen as parallel in the ancient mind, because the river is like, a snake wandering through the countryside. And then when a river overflows, it creates wings. When you look down a river from above, the flooding waters create wings. That's where the dragon comes in. So the combination of a dragon, a serpent, and a flood is a very ancient concept.
Now, I know that some people who are studying prophecy would say, hey, wait, no, I thought waters represented people.
Yeah.
How are you getting words now out of this? Is it because some might say, hey, no, the serpent is sending evil agents against the woman, maybe, or how are you getting that?
Well, the idea of water as nations and stuff, that comes from chapter 17. And that's a valid concept. I mean, it's stated there very directly. But it is chapter 17. And the question is that future passage dominating this scene or not? And I'm not saying it isn't. I'm just saying that it's a legitimate question to ask whether chapter 17 and chapter 12 are intimately connected in that way. It is interesting that the woman is where?
In the wilderness.
When this flood comes up. She's in the wilderness, the desert. Okay. In chapter 17, you have a woman where? In the desert.
Okay.
And that woman has all the trappings of the high priest. So it's a religious figure, but it's clearly a negative religious figure. It's Babylon. So the question we'll come up with in verse 17 is what happened to the woman? Because the woman isn't in verse 17. Yes, Shifra.
So I do think of John being the author of Revelation and also being the author of the Gospel of John, and how water in the Gospel of John, especially in the words of Jesus, signified not just the people aspect in Revelation 17, but now if we go to the Gospel of John, there's the idea of water as the Spirit. And so if water is coming from a serpent that is the devil, who is the ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world, then it's like, I took it as like, oh my goodness, is this like false spirit, like a false. And so I don't know what the perfect answers are. I do see the connections to Genesis 3:13 here, but in essence, we arrive at the same destination, right? There is a connection to the creation story, the fall there, and there is a connection to what the serpent did in the Garden of Eden, to what the serpent is doing in the wilderness.
And I would remind you that as we went through earlier, the heavenly part of chapter 12, we were noticing there that all the images zeroed in on words. It was a war of words. The tail of the dragon is a lying prophet. The serpent, the ancient serpent, Genesis 3. Satan as the accuser. of the brothers. He's the destroyer in chapter 9, but he's the accuser in chapter 12. So it seems chapter 12 may be wanting to focus a bit more on the words that are going by here than simply clash of nations kind of a thing. But I'm open to the other side if any of you want to point out some evidence for that. Yeah.
When you say words, is it semantics? Yeah, just to clarify for the listeners, or is it concepts? Is it ideology? Like, what do we mean when, because I've been here for the conversation through Revelation 12, and it's certainly a mental, but not just mental in terms of like thoughts. I mean, it's the whole soul, right? Thoughts, feelings. So war. So what do we mean by words? If I can give us the opportunity to clarify.
Well, what is the great conflict all about? The battle between Christ and Satan in heaven and ever since. What is it all about? It's about the character of God. About one side saying God is like this and the other side saying God is like that. And then we're trying to sift through the biblical evidence to determine who's telling the truth. So that, I think, is core. Is there military conflict in the course of history? Absolutely. Is there war among the nations? Absolutely. The question is, what's the key focus of this text all about? And we don't want to miss that, even as we're seeing the other.
I would say I think both strategies, I guess, of Satan would be allowed in this sense. You know, you can't say like it's just exclusively words, or it's exclusively nations of evil powers going against the church. And I think we could say it's dual strategies. Like you see the serpent coming out, like you see the dragon coming out. You know, there's this two forces of natures. So it's just this onslaught of falsehood and deceit, but then it's even Satan using other nations and evil powers of people to take out this faithful few that are left.
If the battle is mostly words, what's to stop Satan from thumbing his nose at everything and just crushing out all opposition?
Can you rephrase that?
Is God physically restraining him at all times? In which case, this may be a bit more, quote, violence than we'd like to attribute to God.
Well, I mean, when we think of the idea of restraining, you know, I'm reminded of Job, where God gave him permission to, you know, do what he needed to do to his family, but just don't touch, you know, him. So I do think if the devil, the dragon, was able to just do what he wanted to do, I think there'd be all different kinds of harm. But I think God in some way kind of limits that and says, yeah, you could say what you want to say, but I'm not going to let you do what you want to do.
Why does Satan need to ask permission?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think he's still limited because he did lose the battle. So he still is, to a certain extent, I would say, under the authority of the Almighty. You know, I think when Christ, does what he does on the cross and declares it is finished, you know, the rulership and the ownership and the power and the majesty of planet Earth has now been restored to its rightful owner. And so God, for the sake of the great controversy being played out, allows the devil to reign within certain parameters now.
Mm.
I'd like to suggest that Satan is driven by his original mission. The original mission is to be exalted to the throne, to take the place of God. That's only going to happen if he persuades the universe to trust him in that action. So he is, in a sense, I would suggest, restrained by rules of engagement that the universe has imposed on this conflict.
Mm.
It's going to be a fair playing field. Satan gets to share his idea. God gets to share his idea. The creatures of the universe get to judge. And if it is true, as we believe, that God is the ultimate arbiter and that Satan exists only because God gives him life, If that is the case, then it's an uneven conflict on the face of it. But God has allowed an even-handed conflict for the sake of persuading ultimately the universe that his way is the right way, that we would follow him by choice, not by force or fear or something else. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I was maybe for even a little bit clarification. So we look at it almost like God and this dragon are running their different campaigns, offering what they believe is the best way for life. And God said, hey, you can run your campaign. I'll run mine the way I think I should. And we'll let the people decide which one is better. I guess kind of like what's happening in November, now. I'm not saying which one is the dragon though. So don't.
Well, I think that's a good analogy in the sense that the universe gets the vote, and that God desires no one to follow him because of fear or because they feel like they've been forced. And that's Satan's advantage, because he can attempt to force, he can confuse and deceive. And destroyer is one of his monikers in the book of Revelation. So we have here then the dragon. The woman, we've understood, represents the people of God in this portion of the text, at least. So the dragon is seeking to sweep them away. And what are his methods? Persuasion, deception, and force. And
then force and some form of persecution.
So these images kind of fit both ways. They keep that, and we'll see that constantly as we go through chapter 13 as well. That the two sides of Satan are very pronounced there. What do you make of the earth? It says in verse 16, the earth helps the woman. Is the earth good, bad, indifferent? What's the earth doing here?
Well, the earth opens its mouth and swallows the river. So if the river wasn't helpful to the woman, then the earth is good.
All right, so you think the earth is good here. But
maybe.
Then those who live on the earth throughout Revelation.
Is this a trap?
Are the bad? It might be, yeah. Those who live on the earth are the bad guys. And I would simply observe that earth, in a way, is a neutral concept. If you contrast it with sea, sea is always bad in Revelation. But heaven is always good.
But so there's a sea of glass around.
Yeah. You contrast earth with sea, and earth becomes good by comparison. You contrast earth with heaven, and it's bad by comparison. Those who live in heaven are good. Those who live on the earth, not so good. So here, earth is a positive. And in Revelation 13, we'll notice earth again is in contrast with sea. The beast comes out of the sea, and the beast that comes out of the earth. And so that, I think, is part of what we're going to do in chapter 13. We do need to come to a close here. Our time is just about up. But this has once again been GPS, God's Prophetic Surprises. And I think there's been a few surprises today. We're glad you joined us, and we'll see you again next time.